You're listening to Overwatch Contenders Daily, your path to daily news, scores, and insights into the Overwatch League stars of tomorrow. Here's your host, LemonKiwi.
Hey Overwatch fans, hope you're having a fantastic Wednesday, and if you're not having such a good day, well, I hope it gets better, and I hope this video cheers you up. Today's guest is the man, the myth, the legend, ZP, here today to give us his afterthoughts of the NA Finals and the NA EU Showdown that occurred this past weekend in Poland now that he's back from his long plane trip. But before we get into my interview with ZP, let's get into some Contenders news, and pretty big news bomb. Arrow, Fusion University's ex-coach, has joined the Dallas Fuel as their head coach. So congratulations graduating to the Overwatch League. And we actually interviewed him. CIS Hope, the team that made the semifinals for Europe Contenders, is looking for an organization to represent them. So you might see them under a different banner next season, but hope they find a name to represent. But that's it for the news. Let's get into my interview with ZP. So thanks for joining me, ZP. How's it going? I know you're a little bit sick. It was a long trip back from Poland, right?
Yeah, it was pretty long. I mean, all in all, I think it's about 12, 13 hours of flying. And like any good long international flight, it comes back with a little bit of the plague, where earlier today I was sitting down working at things like, wow, I really hope I'm not getting sick. And now a few hours I was like, wow, I actually got sick. Who would have thought? But other than that, very fun trip. And hey, we got to see some NA versus EU play at the end of it.
Oh my god, that was really exciting. But let's start with the NA Finals. It really wasn't a surprise that Fusion University and Toronto Esports ended up in the finals head-to-head. But what was a shock to me, and maybe a lot of fans out there that are unbiased, of course, was that it was pretty one-sided towards Fusion University's play. But you mentioned in the broadcast, actually, that Fusion University played to their strengths. They really didn't switch up their compositions, whilst I felt Toronto were trying a few new things. And you had said that Toronto were overthinking it. So could you elaborate what went wrong with Toronto throughout the series?
Sure. I mean, if you look to the very beginning, it's very simple. You have Toronto that got to their position being that deep in the playoffs by having very dynamic DPS play, particularly from Dalton and Arrow. And then Toronto decided, wait, here's a great idea. Let's swap to a tank-heavy composition and see if that works out, when it's not a composition they'd really spent any time playing in the run-up to it, and it's not a composition that they played particularly well. More so than that, I mean, you're taking your DPS players and you're putting them in a role that they're not really as accustomed to. It was a strange strategy shift where I think Toronto was hoping that the shock of running that strategy would overcome any deficiencies they had in running it, and it just wasn't the case, where I don't think they played Fusion nearly as closely as they would have if they had just stuck to what had actually gotten them to that point in the beginning.
Yeah, you saw with the first two maps, they're trying to run triple tank, quad tank, and you had said that they had the T virus and that Fusion had the cure, and that was just funny. But yeah, it seemed like when Toronto got back on their normal dive that they felt more comfortable, but it did feel like they were overthinking it a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's because going into it, they saw that Fusion did have, particularly in playing dive, they're playing out of their minds. Maybe they just thought they wouldn't be able to fight them strength for strength, but you do come to an idea where just, okay, you play a certain style to get that far in. I would say that if switching their style worked out, it would be a different narrative where they'd be getting hailed as, wow, look at how adaptive they were. They changed their style last moment and they caught Fusion off guard, and this really worked out well. So that is worth noting, right, is that this is sort of a hindsight judgment, but in reality is that we do know that they play their other style that they use to get their more dive-heavy style much more effectively. So I think it's safe to say it would have been closer. Given how well Fusion was playing in dive versus dive, I'm not sure it would have changed the outcome, but it certainly would have been, I think, a closer series.
It was 4-1 in favor of Fusion for you guys at home that maybe didn't catch it. Obviously, everyone watched it. It was the series to watch, of course, besides the Atlantic Showdown that we'll touch upon in a second. But at least Toronto did pick up a map, and that was on Junkertown. That was their, I guess, bright spot, where they put up a good enough defense for 3 minutes on point C to hold off Fusion for their only map win in the series. So did you feel that when Toronto won Junkertown, things maybe could have started to shift around, being down 0-3?
I think at that point it's always difficult to go and do the reverse sweep, but they did look more like vintage Toronto at that point, where you think back to some of the series that Toronto won in the regular season, they did do it off of long extended holds towards the very end of a map, built off of gutsy play by Dalton and Arrow, and that was a huge element there where going into the final point, what we saw is that Dalton and Arrow came alive on that Junkertown last, and were able to do that early in the series if they were able to play the normal comps. It might have been a little bit different, but in terms of waking up and changing momentum, yes, they looked stronger, but to do a reverse sweep, you sort of have to completely reverse momentum, where then you have to outplay on every single map from there on out, and it just wasn't super likely. But it was a better showing for them for sure, obviously, because they did take the map.
Yeah, it was their bright spot, and you were maybe all of us were hoping for a closer series, but speaking of that momentum, we're now moving on to the Atlantic Showdown, where it was Fusion versus Hurricane. Of course, the Hurricane being the winner of the EU, that's why they're there. Where it was super, you want to say friendly, bantery. I felt a lot of tension in that series, at least between the talent of NA and EU, casting all between you guys, but EU ended up winning 3-1, or Hurricane took the series 3-1, with Lunar Colony being Fusion's only win. But I know you were, I wouldn't say annoyed, but there was some banter around this quad tank, where both tanks are incredibly talented, not to take away from that, but do you think Fusion's lack of success was due to Hurricane playing triple quad tank and not having experience to play against it?
Well, first off, just to touch on the bantery stuff, we did ham that up a bit. Like, before, in case anyone ever watched, I got the feeling like, man, this is pretty tense going into there. You know, these guys that like each other. It's like the entire idea going into that show match is that we would, ham it up and just sort of act as rivals and sort of be homers for the region that we came from there. So we sort of took a narrative decision of, we're going to make this fun. You're going to represent EU. I'm going to represent NA. And we're going to banter a little bit. We're going to have some pride in our regions and go from there. So that was really fun. And all credit to Des for helping make that just a really entertaining cast. But so that aside, absolutely. I think Fusion really, there was a general sentiment from NA teams where no one really enjoyed playing against Quad Tank. And the idea for the EU teams is that they would run it until an NA team proved they could deal with it. And when you look at the compositions that Fusion was actually running against a Quad Tank, it was a little bit confusing because talking with people post-mortem of, okay, well, what went wrong here? The general consensus from a lot of teams, especially on the OWL side, like OWL players that are watching, et cetera, is that why didn't they run Junkrat? And the answers have ranged everything from, well, maybe Fusion didn't feel all that comfortable running it, where they didn't run it quite as often as other teams in the regular season, to things like, hey, in that for how they play, it really should be who are you running Junkrat, but who are you, really doesn't like running the hero. So that was a problem within the series, and they just tried to brute force basically a composition that was suboptimal against the quad tank setup. It is, I mean, to answer the question in short, yeah, they didn't handle the quad tank very well, and that's a huge reason as to why they ended up losing.
But at least on Lunar Colony, which was Fusion's only win, they won it just, narrowly. Both teams finished the map with less than a minute left, and it came down to Fusion's second attack. They just snowballed it to point B. Beast Taylor going off with the Nano, with the hyper-aggressive attack that they were pulling off. Then on Hurricane's second attack, they ran quad tank, but this time didn't take point B. So how were Fusion able to stop the quad tank there?
Well, I'd say, first of all, you look at Point B Horizon, it's not exactly a fun area to quad tank into. You literally have rafters that people can hide up on, and if you're running the style quad tank that Hurricane was, that isn't exactly a super mobile version of quad tank, it's very easy to get perfect engages dropping down, pick your targets. Certainly, it was something that Elk really enjoyed, where Elk had basically infinite room to work with, where he wasn't pressured at all. He put on a really good showing as on in there, but I would just say the positioning of Point B Horizon wasn't very conducive to Hurricane putting on a quick attack in the moment. And also, you think about how they're approaching it, how Fusion could counter engage. Fusion was running the Sombra on the defense, and you have a bunch of people all grouped up in a vantage point where Sombra can literally just drop off a ceiling and land a good EMP, on top of the fact that you have Elk doing a bunch of work. I mean, basically, not only were they able to run a better composition against the quad tank there, but the positioning advantage was massive.
So if you were, let's say, Fusion's coach in this situation, going up against quad tank, I know you said they were playing to their strengths. That's what they did to Toronto, and that's why they had they were so good against Toronto, but they didn't switch anything up against Hurricane. So what would you have suggested maybe as a coach for them to go? Like, should they bring out their own quad tank, or what's the change to do there?
Well, I mean, the starter, I will use the often used phrase that we heard from many a team during the weekend, which is that Junkrat is a thing. For every team except Fusion University, where Junkrat was not a thing, because God only knows. Certainly they should have looked to running that, and I mean, more than anything else, they also, like I said, they didn't really play against the quad tank very well in terms of like how they're engaging in on it. They had plenty of times where they were, say respecting Roadhog hooks and would get hooked and die immediately. Just their experience of playing against the composition was bad. The compositions they were running against it was bad. And it's an interesting thing because let me say this just broad spectrum about the heavy tank setups is that here's the hard part in evaluating it, right? Is that you look at the highest levels of playing the game. You don't see it working at the OWL level beyond like gimmick first points at best, right? So it is safe to take the judgment that it might not be an effective strategy when everyone's playing super well. But you also get into this idea that Contenders, by its very nature, is going to involve teams that are less well-rounded, less overall experienced, and there might be these sort of gap zones where tank-heavy setup can be very effective because you're dealing with a team that doesn't have the versatility and sort of ability to prepare in the way that an OWL team would. So is quad tank something that right now can be used at the tier 2 level fairly effectively, sort of taking advantage of that gap zone in OWL play, or sorry, Overwatch play? It very well might be.
So you think Junkrat could have came in, Fusion could have maybe played better against the quad tank, but maybe it would have been nice to see something different. But the drastic changes in composition led to some questions for me, at least.
Also, just real quick, I would also say credit where credit due to Hurricane, right? Where we're very Fusion focused right now, but it's also probably worth noting that yes, as focused we are on the Fusion, for the Fusion to still lose with running as good as players as they have, with players like who are you playing as well as they did throughout the day, Elk having good series, etc. Hurricane themselves started to play really well and executing what they did, right? Because we saw what a badly executed quad tank did earlier in the series, which was nothing. So Fusion did play very well, and I don't want to take anything away from that.
Well, we've seen bad quad tanks from bye week already at Contenders, but already mentioned Hurricane are incredibly talented, deserve their win from the EU side, and very shockingly, well, I was shocked of how one-sided even the Atlantic Showdown was, to be honest, but it was exciting to see, quad tank and dive and the mix of metas between the two regions. But the final part, Contenders is all about showcasing these players, these different types of metas for the upcoming Overwatch League scene, for them to eventually graduate to the upper levels. So from casting this or Contenders season for so long and seeing the growth of these players and teams, who would be your top players that you would pick or would think would get picked up for the Overwatch League?
So let me just say as a disclaimer here, I don't see this as an all list. There's almost certainly going to be a player in this list that I don't mention that ends up getting the OWL, whether it be now or in the future, but I would say, first and foremost, you look at the Fusion roster, where a gigantic amount of the roster very well could end up making it in. Who are you? Alarm, probably the two most notable, right? But then you also have Elk, who had a very good support showing and also well known for his in-game leader chops. I think made a case. Zachary was probably the most improved player from last year's season of Contenders to here, and made a good showing for himself. Then you move on to Toronto, right? And Dalton and Nero both had a very good season. They brought Toronto all the way into the semifinals. Wasn't quite enough to get through Toronto, but they looked great. Then you think about the tanks that we saw that really excelled over the course of the season. Panker on Gladiators, Smurf on Optic, both really, really good. And hey, while on the topic of Optic, what do you have there but Sharp and Gray, where Sharp was a Tracer prodigy throughout most of the season. Arguably, you could say he had a little bit of an underperformance in the live environment, but how much of that was just who are you playing out of his mind? How much was first live event jitters? Who could say? But that's kind of where that was. And then we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Gray, where, Gray was just remarkably consistent all throughout the season. And then let's give a shout out to a player that didn't make it into playoffs, but sense was very impressive even as his teams were falling apart. And you have a player like Retzi, right, where Retzi was very, very good overall, and probably didn't have the team to back him up the way that other players did. But I could see Retzi being a gem or a diamond in the rough as well. So there was a rich batch of talent here, and that's good, right? Because you think about OWL and how things are going to be expanding in the future, how you're going to have more teams, and more teams looking to fill up the rosters as well. You need these players. So the odds that most of the players I just listed get into OWL, well, when they're of age at the very least,
yeah. Yeah, there's a few underagers, so at least it gives them a good practice ground in the contenders scene. But you've named just a bunch of people. Yes. I did not expect that many, and even from some teams that actually didn't make the playoffs and stuff like that. And a bunch of them being underage, but in a couple of years we'll see them. I think Sharp is underage in a few of them, but I've been enjoying Contenders because it gives you the show. It does showcase the up and coming players that we could see in the Overwatch League, whether pretty soon or in a couple years. But that will be the end of the interview. Thank you, ZP, for coming on. I know you're sick, but this was pretty fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And hey, look, the future for Contenders is bright. There's still 2 more seasons this year, and I'm just looking forward to when things start up again.
Hey, we're excited too. But thank you for coming on. This was Overwatch Contenders Daily. I'm LemonKiwi, and we're going to see you guys next week.